This is Duke University.
I don't think we ever do interdisciplinarity as a project or an agenda, which leads me then finally to a question which I put to Barbara, which might seem unrelated to what I've said, but I'm sure she will see the relationship immediately. Why, if you did, you give up literary courses?
So many excellent questions have been put to me, and so many characterizations have been uttered. One of the things that I jotted down as I was listening to these moving presentations was I was remembering the last line, if I'm not wrong, of Herbert's poem Prayer, which goes, "Something understood." I don't think I gave up anything. I moved around a lot, as I have sometimes said. I've changed hats, but never changed heads. There didn't seem to be any discontinuity. I think just having heard, I liked Rob's characterization of just, opening up, maybe too many openings on the networks. That is, it just, one thing led to another. I was going to say, and will say in a minute, just that there have been some things in my personal history that led me to have the status something like Tiresias. You may recall that Tiresias had the experience of being both male and female, and therefore was able to say something, was an authority on the pleasures of each. So my personal history, growing up in New York City in the 1940s, running around from, I was a very serious junior astronomer and was a very serious fan of poetry, running around the city from the Hayden Planetarium to the 92nd Street Y in order to hear Dylan Thomas do a reading there. And that this has simply continued. I love, actually, Stoppard's play Arcadia, because it does make a good stab at evoking a world before there were two cultures. I grew up in a world before there were two cultures. Or I grew up in a world where that simply wasn't apparent. All of my friends, we did all of these things continuously. That is, we would meet at the Junior Astronomy Club, then we would go down to the Museum of Modern Art, we'd catch an avant-garde flick, then we would go to the Riverside Memorial Church and listen to a Bach oratorio, and there were no two cultures. We were greedy for all of the cultures that were available. And we went into different channels. Some of them became mathematicians, others worked for the NIH. Some of them became poets, and some of them became psychiatrists. But that possibility of being able to elaborate aspects of one's hunger for culture along a number of lines seems to me something that I didn't have to give up when I became certified as, actually in succession, a humanist, then a social scientist. I was a professor of communications for 14 years. But I had a certain amount of certification as a junior astronomer anyway, and then a full-time humanist. But in doing that, I did not have to turn my back on anything that I had been earlier. So if you'll allow me now, if that's all right, I will turn to a few pages, but just a few. very, very much. I must thank, yes, should I move? I don't want to fall off. Thanks to Ian Balcom, thanks to the Franklin Humanities Institute, thanks to Chris, thanks to John, for putting together such a terrific show, and to the symposium participants for their amazing presentations, and for their appreciations, enough to sate even the greediest authorial or professorial mandate. And thanks to my friends and colleagues and students for being here today and for being part of my life during these very happy years at Duke. As Ian mentioned, the symposium topic was my own suggestion. I thought of it for two reasons. One was that the potentially agreeable inhabitation that it names, science in the humanities, is something that I have fostered throughout my professional life. The other was that the two matched disagreeable dispositions that it names, scientism and anti-science in the humanities, are both very much in evidence these days, and it seemed worthwhile to bring together some experts on these questions to talk about on this occasion. The fact that they all happen to be my friends, colleagues, and students. It's just massive. They've done so throughout this day, I think, very magnificently. I had mentioned my being something of a Tiresias, but the point of my bringing it up is that the double identification has given me what I hope has been a useful perspective on the relations between the sciences and the humanities. Thank you. I always use it with plural, except when I don't. And has certainly energized the projects that have been kindly mentioned here. The brief remarks that I want to add concern, first, certain perennially hapless types of science borrowing in literary studies, and second, the current promotion of certain dubious transdisciplinary futures. Dubious is, when I was at MLA, I was president of MLA for a year, and every word, and that occurred during the depths and heights of the science wars and the culture wars. Every word that I uttered, private, hardly ever spoke, hardly ever speak even on the telephone. Suddenly people were calling me up all the time to know what the president of MLA wanted to say about this. And I knew from listening on the telephone that the pencil never even hit the pad until I said something sensational and awful that could be quoted. So I learned and had people at MLA. They were appointed to me. I didn't know that I could have this service of vetting everything that I said to make sure that it would not embarrass me or the organization or all of my fellow scholars. The word dubious was one that I learned to substitute for a lot of other So to go back to those problems, many here will recall efforts in the 1960s and 70s to update or upgrade literary studies by importing models, concepts, terms, and techniques from, in rapid succession, information theory, a then new program in communications engineering, structuralism, a then new program in linguistics, and speech act theory, a then new program in philosophy. And I must say to Jonathan that when I spoke of the total act of speech, it was not from speech act theory, nobody had heard of it yet. And I wrote that was 1961, it's my PhD dissertation. But I really was drawing from. There was B.F. Skinner's verbal behavior, and Skinner's insistence, of course, as we put him at odds with Chomskyan linguistics for many, for half a century. For Skinner, it was very important that language was behavior, and what he emphasized, among other things, and Tim, you picked it up absolutely right. That way of putting it was very important, and it has been all along. But what Skinner emphasized was that language was not just, a set of letters on a page. Derrida came to that point, also a little bit later. But the Derridian and the Skinnerian, they work very well together, in my still can be put together in interesting ways. So when I spoke of the poem, The Utterance, as the total speech act, what I wanted to emphasize there was its embodiment, was the fact that there were intonation patterns, that there were suprasegmental features, that there were many, many aspects to a language that were being characterized by a more formalist linguistics. And that was what the emphasis was. You're probably right about the mimetic aspect. That wasn't the best way of putting it, to say. But I think I would still want to have that emphasis on the total speech act. Not that we ever know anything total, but at least to enrich the notion of what it is that language is and how it operates it in poetry. And I know you disagree with that at all. But as I was listing on the science of water, the science of borrowing projects in the 60s and 70s, the idea was to upgrade or update literary studies by applying them. That verb was, I think of applique. So applying could mean, and it could have a very rich sense, and it could mean operating through the practice of something, but it could mean applying in the sense of slapping on to the outside, right? Well, applying them to the study of poems, novels, fairy tales, and detective stories seem to be what was involved. In each case, the efforts were earnest, the applications technically informed, the results minimally illuminating for all concerned, and the whole enterprise obsolete in a couple of years. There are a couple of reasons why this pattern repeats itself. One is the typically uncritical relation of the literary borrowers to the ideas, approaches, and other materials that are borrowed from the higher status disciplines. Such diffidence is, of course, in part understandable and indeed proper. Nevertheless, it can have a stultifying effect on the borrower's project because it short-circuits the crucial feedback loop that is the engine of theoretical development in any field, and that is the ongoing, it's going to sound very barbaric or Smithian, the ongoing mutual adjustment of theory and application, and not application in the other sense. In other words, the ongoing way in which, so if you are deferential and diffident with regard to the theory that you are borrowing from, science, psychology, information theory, and so forth, slap it on, because it operates for you as intellectual bedrock, your application of it cannot change it. You're also in the unfortunate position of being the lower stakes discipline, which has other consequences, which I'll mention with the second point. A second reason why that unhappy pattern repeats itself is the tendency of scholars eager to import concepts and methods from other fields to be relatively ignorant of or impatient with achievements in their own fields. This is again to some extent understandable if one undertakes to master the leading theories of evolutionary psychology and cognitive science, including the details of brain topography. Then one may have little time to read carefully the works of, say, Jonathan Carr, Stanley Fish, or Frederick Jameson. But unless literary scholars are able to integrate the ideas, models, and methods they are appropriating from other fields with the most significant and vital ideas, models, and methods in their home field, including its prevailing verbal and conceptual idioms. That's always the problem what you do with all that language. Then their efforts at interdisciplinarity are likely to end in omnidisciplinary sterility of limited interest, limited intellectual interest anyway, to scientists in the fields from which those ideas are borrowed. And alien, wooden, inert, irrelevant to their fellow scholars and humanities. So this is the danger. Of course, this is not to say that genuinely fertile interdisciplinary studies can't be pursued in humanities disciplines. The point is well attested by the work of, among others, the participants in this symposium. Theoretical, original, archival, and empirical investigations in the history, sociology, and science, rigorously developed accounts of the cognitive, cultural operations of the new media, work that challenges classic dichotomies of mind and body, standard views of the interface between technology and human, and I could go on. I have even scratched the surface of all of the tremendously interesting work, ongoing work that is being done by this amazing array of young people. What makes their studies genuinely generative are, yes, the rigor, also the subtlety, also the sophistication of their engagement with all of the fields and texts and topics they consider, whether techno-scientific, literary, cultural, or philosophical, and the combined seriousness and confidence with which they explore the historical, interpretive, and theoretical questions that are raised by their own investigations. The second problematic project that I was going to mention, and I will say a few words about it, has already been mentioned several times today, and of course it's been an ongoing concern in my work and for many of us. And that stems from the idea that the so-called two-culture gap would be healed if the hopelessly pre-scientific humanities, along with the floundering social sciences, were absorbed into the more orderly and grown-up natural sciences. And of course, what I have in mind here is the project of what's now called vertical integration, which is to say pure reduction. That's what it consists of. Incorporation and reduction, called vertical integration, originally promoted by biologist Bill Wilson in his book Consilience, subsequently elaborated by various evolutionary psychologists, and now promoted by quite a large number of enthusiasts across the academy, and also outside of it, and also with the contrary to the popular metaphorics of such unification projects, the gap between the two cultures is not, in my view, a pathological condition to be healed. Here, again, I want to thank Liz for talking about incommensurability and what she did, because I think that's a quite important point. And that is, she hit so many nails on the head. Well, but this would be an echo of one of the points that she makes. So the gap is not to be, and it's not a gap. It is rather a natural enough outcome of the multiple orientations of human cognition, or if you like, human ecology. That is the fact that we relate to our environments as both agents and subjects, dispassionate observers and involved participants, explainers and interpreters, as both creatures who seek to advance our knowledge of and practical control over the material conditions of our existence, but who seek also to develop, enlarge, and manifest ourselves as experiencing, reflective, creative beings, and as such are engaged and instructed by the experiences, reflections, and creations of our fellow creatures. I'm so glad, Nancy, that you remembered that I wrote short sentences sometimes. These complementary sets of roles can be seen as constituting an array of equally fundamental but significantly different cognitive orientations that have been aligned in various combinations historically, but that are currently reflected in the multiple distinctions of domain, and objective, and method, and perspective, and style, and idiom that mark, respectively, the natural sciences and the humanities. The problems of the two cultures, such as they may be, are not solved by creating a monoculture, or what I call myself a supernatural science. They can be ameliorated, however, by a better instructed appreciation all around of what the others are doing, and reciprocally, notice notion, by a better pedagogic effort all around to explain patiently and respectfully to the others what one is doing itself. There is, of course, more to say on all these topics, and I plan to be doing so in the months ahead, but I'll hopefully writing this. Just as I never promised in becoming a certified humanist to stop reading science, I never promised in retiring from teaching to stop writing or talking, or in fact, teaching.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.